we are not cured of.
Clearly.
And it's not just a matter of it not being polite to say in public. That's not the measure of whether racism still exists or not.
Well, that was President Obama in an interview released yesterday with digital radio host Mark Maron. And today, for the second straight day, the White House had to defend the president's decision to use one of the most racially charged words in the English language. The president's senior advisor saying her boss was glad that his words triggered this honest conversation on race. Brit Hume is our Fox News senior political analyst. Brit, did it? Are we there?
No, and we're not going to get there by virtue of what the president said. First of all, let me make it perfectly clear. I don't have any problem with the president saying that word, because he didn't really use the word. Using the word implies that you labeled somebody with that term. That's what the problem with that word is, when people use it as a label, as a hateful epithet. That's not the context in which he used that word. He was mentioning the word. He wasn't really using it. But we are so concerned with being careful not to be labeled racist ourselves that we on this network, and so far as I know every other network, won't even allow him to be heard saying that. We bleep it out, which in some ways I think is a little absurd, but it illustrates the problem that the president claims he's trying to exist. He wants an honest conversation about race, but he's dealing with a people who are so afraid of being labeled racist, especially white Americans, because they're the ones that have most often been accused of this, and in many cases for a long time it was a legitimate charge because racism was institutionalized in America. It was built into laws. It was permitted. It was tolerated. It was culturally acceptable. That is no longer true. The institutionalization of racism, I think, has been largely obliterated. Even Hillary Clinton says that.
And the president doesn't seem to agree. I mean, he keeps making comments. He just said this the other day. He said, look, things have gotten better. Don't tell me to the young people of America that they haven't from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. But he went on to say, but the legacy of Jim Crow, discrimination in almost every institution of our lives, that casts a long shadow. That's still part of our DNA. We are not cured of it.
Well, look, Professor Dr. Obama may say that, and he may, to some extent, be right about that. But what troubles me here is he and other liberals periodically call for an honest conversation about race. They don't really want an honest conversation about race. In fact, the issue of race has been enormously beneficial to President Obama. His defenders often say that he's treated the way, because he's black, the way no other president would. But the things that have been said about other presidents, white presidents, belie that. In addition to that, I think Americans, by and large, were impressed with Barack Obama and wanted to see him move up in the world and become president, in part because he was black. And I think his race has been an asset to him politically and otherwise, perhaps. And when he says he wants an honest conversation about race, and he uses the N-word or says the N-word without ever really using it, and we're so afraid of being accused of racism in America that we won't even let him be heard saying that. That gives you an idea of the climate. And it gives you an idea of why nobody wants to have that conversation, because if you, for example, held a view that racism is kind of a human characteristic, that people of all races share it, and that you can never really wipe it out, that all you can do is to try to create a society in which it is institutionally impermissible, that it is culturally unacceptable, and that it is regarded as a form of hatred, which I think we're on a long way to doing. I think people who would want to make that argument may be afraid that they'd be accused of being racist for making it. That's the problem we have. The great triumph of the civil rights movement was making racism politically, culturally, and otherwise unacceptable in America. But it placed a cudgel in the hands of those who would exploit it, a la Al Sharpton and others. Al Sharpton, by the way, whom the president consults with and consorts with, who've used that for all sorts of racial demagoguery and something bordering on blackmail.
But is it just race? Because the president, he seems to cast this judgment on the American people about how we are, it's part of our DNA. Jim Crow is part of our DNA still, our DNA. I think a lot of people would say it isn't. He says it is. And then in the same day, he's speaking to a group of Muslims, and he talks about how he lamented the distorted impression that many Americans have of Muslims, and stressed that we need to be much more conscious about religious tolerance toward Muslims. He's not so stressing about the religious tolerance towards Christians when they try to express their deeply held views, but he wants religious tolerance towards Muslims because he feels that the American people have a distorted impression of them.
Well, he seems to be an advocate against bigotry in certain cases, but not all. He doesn't seem to be too preoccupied with anti-Christian bigotry, for example. Mm-hmm. He seems to some extent, I would say, intolerant of the way that Christians practice their faith. This whole case against the Little Sisters of the Poor being an example of that, which the administration, they're fighting the Little Sisters of the Poor in the Supreme Court. This is the kind of thing that goes on, and I would say about that, Megyn, that the president has been too selective in this for him to have credibility on the issue.
It's interesting to hear the messaging, and we've got some folks talking out of both sides of their mouth, and we'll speak about that in the next segment. Explain what we mean. The New York Times came out last week and said any hopes of a post-racial era now seem fanciful under this president.
Well, under this president, yeah, and one has to ask the question of to what extent he's responsible for that. Whether his conduct in office and the way he's handled the issue has made things worse, not better.
Brit, great to see you.
You too, Megyn.
Well, there was outrage in Oklahoma tonight after an illegal immigrant runs down a beloved TV